There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I am just so full of joy today that you're not going to be able to stand me. I don't have any really personal news, focused on all the stuff that goes into moving and all that jazz, but that's all for the good. And I haven't had any bookish experiences. I have one tonight, I think, if I get my Friday Reads posted in time, but I'll tell you about that next week. I guess the bookish highlight of the week, aside from some fabulous reading, is Mum and I had brunch with Sharon Batalla last Sunday, and that was lovely. If you're thinking to yourself, that's the loudest blouse Sean's ever worn on his channel, you probably would be right. You're going to have to watch The Mystery Guest, because I told my mystery guest the story, so I'm not going to tell it twice. Nothing personal other than that, but life is absolutely freaking beautiful. I have a special guest. It's not my mystery guest, but I'm going to be a little bit mysterious for the next 7 seconds about this person, but it's not my official mystery guest this week, about a giveaway. Let's hear all about that. I'm joined for a wonderful little chat and surprise here with the Irish novelist Cauvery Madhavan, who lives in County Cork in Ireland, but is gallivanting in Europe. I believe you're skiing in the French Alps or something, aren't you, Cauvery?
That's right, Sean. It sounds so very fancy, but I'm accompanying my husband here. He's the one skiing. I stopped skiing a good few years ago. Such a fear of falling that I would jinx myself into falling every single time. Yeah.
The only few times I ever tried downhill skiing, I made a few new trails and it was a disaster. So this is the big Irish month, March, and there is a readathon on BookTube annually called the Irish Readathon, and lots of other people just read Irish lit for the month. Cauvery and I thought it would be a good month. She suggested it. What a wonderful idea to do a giveaway on my channel for my subscribers. I'm going to limit that in a way, but for her most recent novel, her wonderful novel, The Inheritance, which came out in 2024, I have a lovely chat with her about it, as well as with Rónán Hession about his novel, Ghost Mountain, that I'll link in the show notes, is doing a giveaway, and I have suggested that we limit entrance to people who don't live in Ireland and don't live in the UK. Those people can get a copy of The Inheritance much more easily than people in the rest of the world, so I'm going to limit it to people watching who live anywhere else, Europe, Africa, Canada, America, wherever you are. But if you live in the UK or Ireland, just go out and buy it and send Cauvery a few bucks that way. So Cauvery, give us a little elevator pitch for The Inheritance.
Okay, Sean. So The Inheritance is set in the very, very beautiful Beara Peninsula in the southwest tip of Ireland. And it's set in the 1980s. It's about a young London Irish lad who inherits a cottage from his granduncle at a time when everybody else is leaving Ireland. It's a time of great depression and recession in Ireland. He comes to Ireland while the rest of the young men of Ireland are leaving. And it's a story of what happens to him when he arrives, his entanglement with a local young woman and her son, who's 7 years old and nonverbal. And right through the modern story, which is set in 1986, there is a thread running through from 400 years before, which is the story of O'Sullivan Beara, one of the last Irish chieftains to hold out against the English. And he had actually holed himself up in Glengariff Forest for over 6 months. And so there's a thread from that episode in history running through the book.
Said, and I would supplement that great elevator pitch with saying that the characters in this novel are so incredibly well drawn and inviting. I loved Marlowe with all my heart, and all the other characters, major and minor, that you introduce us to, and also the setting. I gave your novel one of my besties and worsties award for the best setting, the most vivid setting of anything I read last year. And I think you know the area some well. You didn't have to go to Google to research this part of Ireland. Tell us more about the setting and why you know it so well.
I took a lazy way out as a writer in that I set the book in our own house. Initially, it was a lazy way out because it's so much easier for me to describe something that I knew like the back of my hand, because we've had the house for about 25 years now. And it's a remote valley in an already remote peninsula. The entire book, I have been very faithful to the geography and the history of the peninsula. Very faithful, actually. Whatever I described actually exists and is actually there.
And I checked that out. I fact checked a lot and everything came up on Google. So, yes. And the verb that I would use is steeped. This novel is steeped in the geography and the history. Yeah. It just lives and breathes the history and the setting. It was a remarkable work of fiction. Cauvery, I think your hubby's out skiing. Since you always write what you know, are you writing your next novel or maybe just a short story based on your hotel room in the French Alps?
No, not quite, but I am actually writing my next book this week. I am spending time immersing myself back into the writing process. I'm about a chapter and a half into my next book, and I've been writing every morning while he's been on the slopes. And it's great to be back writing. It's where I'm happiest. And this is a book, the one I'm writing now, it's a book that I've been thinking about for at least 20 years. So I'm really ready to write it now.
This will be about a 6-day giveaway, open for about 6 days. I'm going to cut off the random entries at 6 p.m. UK and Irish time.
Okay.
Is the cutoff on Thursday, March 20th, and I will do the random draw during the taping of my Friday Reads next week, which will be on March 21st. And so to enter, you just have to put your name in the comments on this video, say that you're interested, and I'll do a random draw. And then after that, you will have to email me your address and stuff and how you want it inscribed to yourself. And Cauvery will get that off in the mail to you. And this, again, is open to people who don't live in Ireland and don't live in the UK. And there's a beautiful bookmark that goes along with it, which I have a few copies of. And Cauvery is going to put one of those in the package too.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm only delighted to do this giveaway, especially on the Irish Readathon month.
That's right. So this is very exciting. Cauvery, thanks for such a wonderful idea. And I'll be in touch with you next week. And everybody, you know what to do. Put your name below if you'd like to be entered for the random draw for this book. Cauvery, thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean.
I'm not sure that the rules came out in a jumble or not, so let me try to say it more clearly. If you want to enter, you've got the next 6 days until the evening of next Thursday, which is March 20th. To just put your name, make a comment. You don't have to give me your real name in the comment, but just put a comment below saying, please enter me. And then I'm going to do a random draw during the filming of next week's Friday Reads. And then Cauvery is going to send you her book signed to you with a lovely bookmark. Enter below if you are interested. If you live in Ireland or the UK, just go buy the book, as I said in the chat with her. Support her that way. But other people that are going to have more trouble to get their hands on a copy, please enter. It's a wonderful novel. And without further ado, here is this week's extremely interesting mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is the Saskatchewan writer, Amy Boyce, here to tell us about her debut novel called Yes, Miss Thompson, which came out in 2023. And she is joining us from her home in Warman, Saskatchewan, which is near Saskatoon. Amy, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'm excited to be so mysterious for you today.
There you go. So am I. This novel sounds like it's so much up my alley. And in fact, I can vouch for it in a certain sense because I chose this as a Christmas present for my mum the year it came out. And she really enjoyed it. That's why it's on my radar. So we're going to do something unconventional here. Amy has produced a fabulous book trailer for this book. And it's so well done that I suggested to her that we just plunk it in here and let you enjoy it, and that will cover a lot of ground that we'd ordinarily cover just in conversation. So here it is. Please enjoy.
Hi, my name is Amy Boyce, and I have written Yes, Miss Thompson, a story about my great-grandmother. Now, Marjorie was always in my childhood a shadowy character, somebody who I didn't know. She passed away before I was born. But I knew a few things about her, that she was a school teacher and that she was the principal of a high school, which during the 40s and 50s and 60s was a little bit rare for a woman to be. I was intrigued by her story, so I started to dig through photo albums, shipped manifests, newspaper articles, census, and I discovered many things about Marjorie which had been almost forgotten to the past. I know that she immigrated from England when she was a child, that she went to the University of Manitoba as a young woman, and that she really raised herself up by the bootstraps. And she was so well set up as a career woman, as a teacher, and then she made a catastrophic mistake. And this error of judgment affected herself, her children, all of us, whether or not we even realize this. And this is the story of Yes, Miss Thompson. It's told from my perspective in the present day, doing the research, asking questions, finding amazing treasure troves of material. Also from the perspective of my mother when she was a little girl and seeing Marjorie at that point as an old woman. And then from Marjorie's perspective, I've reimagined what her experience was like immigrating from England to a small farm just north of Brandon, Manitoba in 1904.
All right, so I have so many questions about writing about a great-grandmother and writing family history and fictionalizing family history. What was the process of fictionalizing this family story?
Yeah, how did it start? It started with finding a photo album of Marjorie Thompson's amazing trip in 1929 Great Lake cruise. Something really no one does anymore, where you go from Detroit to Chicago and stops along the way. And it was very glamorous, and she kept all the menus and information about her travels, and she put it in this great book. And as a child, it was a treat to be able to open that book. And there was always an adult with you. It just seemed like she was like a movie star to me, these beautiful black and white pictures. And that was my jumping off point. She was a glamorous character in 1929, and our family talked about her at that point, and then everything just stopped. There wasn't a lot of talking about her after that. And whenever there's a secret, there's curiosity. And once I started to ask more about her, I learned that she had been so accomplished and so successful, but she made a really poor choice in life, and that really changed the direction of her life. Her life was no longer about travel and exploration. It became more about putting food on the table, and it became very serious. I should back up. Around 2020, I started doing research for this book, just around the beginning of the pandemic in that area, a little bit before. And my grandparents were aging. They were starting to forget the stories. So I realized that this was the moment to do the research while those stories were still there. Part of writing about family is separating the lore from the truth. And I would hear stories, and then I would go and look up the facts, and they were close. The stories were close, but simple things like I was always told that Marjorie and her family landed in Halifax, Pier 21, because that feels like the right thing. But when I did the research and dug into the manifest, I found out they landed in Montreal. Now, not a big thing, but you start to question, okay, how much of these family stories are true and how much is just lore? Fictionalizing in some ways is not hard because you start to wonder if everything's been fictionalized to this point. But really digging into the research, finding the facts is the place to begin, and then imagining what would it have felt like to be a child immigrating to Canada. Your father has already left to find a farm, and here you are with your mother and your 4 other siblings, and you're crossing the big Atlantic Ocean, never to return. That's a big thing. So that's where it began.
And then the process of adding fictional nuance to that, was there a certain point in the writing process where it became a fictional character and it wasn't your great-grandmother anymore? How does that part work? I'm always fascinated by that.
Yeah, I think the early years where we're going back 100 years, where neither my grandmother or my mother or my grandfather, none of them were there. So we as a family could accept that this is a fictional imagining of this time and space. Because I tell Marjorie's story over her lifetime, at the moments when my mom remembered her and my grandmother knew her, I started checking in with them a little bit more. Like, do you feel comfortable? Would she have said that? Would she have done that? That was great to have them say, I don't think she would have, or that was spot on. That's exactly what she would have done.
Oh, great. And that anticipates my next question, which is, and you don't have to get too personal in your answer, but did you get any pressure from family members, to
Simple thing is,
besmirch? Grandma.
You don't talk to the family. You just don't talk to them. You don't tell them what you're doing. So my mom and my grandma, they were my editors. And because they also feature as characters in this story, I wanted to have their sign off. My grandmother, initially, she didn't like what I wrote. So we had a conversation about how I portrayed her. The things she didn't were mostly just that she's aging. And when she saw that written about herself, she didn't like it. So we had a conversation. I said, I'll take this out. And by that time, a day or two later, she's, no, the writing is good. And it's true. Leave it in. And I think that's fair. That's just seeing yourself reflected in a mirror and going, oh, I don't feel like I'm 89, but I guess I am. And as far as the wider family, I never consulted. I just press on.
And I am fascinated by the cover. Apparently, it's a photograph. It looks like a painting to me. It's just gorgeous. What can you tell us about the cover?
The cover is obviously agricultural based. We've got a farm, we've got a barn. Farms were a big part of Marjorie's experience. Her father moved to Canada to find a farm, and the farm he landed on, the farm he found, was very worn down. It only had a log cabin, which the family lived in for the first 20 years. By that point, there were 6 children, 2 adults in a log cabin for 20 years. Although this farm, the barn is maybe a little bit tired now in this modern photograph, that very barn would have been a symbol of success for them. They were really subsistence farmers when they first came to Canada. And then in the shadows, I don't know if you can see, there's actually a picture of Marjorie superimposed in the clouds.
Oh my God. I knew there was something going on, but I didn't look at it closely enough. Yes, absolutely. Oh, now I love the cover even more.
And that was a picture taken on her Grand Niagara, the Great Lakes tour, where she was very glamorous.
I believe that picture might be in that trailer video, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us, and maybe this question is directed towards Marjorie Thompson, the literary character. Tell us more about her.
When Marjorie immigrated with her family from England to Manitoba, we know that the family had aspirations to build a big farm. And perhaps that would have happened, but Marjorie's life was strongly affected by major world events. And the first one I would think is World War I. Out of the district, Hemiota Miniota, this is north of Brandon in Manitoba, there were so many young men who were taken from their community to go and fight, and they just never returned. Marjorie's brother, he returned, but he had been gassed multiple times and he had health issues because of that. When you read the lists in the newspaper every week, I think it's hard for us to understand how Canada was so strongly affected by World War I, the loss of life. During that time in Marjorie's life, she stopped teaching, from what I can tell from the research, because there's just no evidence that she was teaching, and probably moved home to help on the farm because there was a manpower shortage. So already you have this disruption of people's lives. Her siblings were not able to go to high school during that time because they were either on the farm or serving in the forces. So her siblings' education got delayed. They went to high school as adults, to community college at Brandon, and that's how they finished their education. So we have that immediate disruption. During the 1920s, I think we see Marjorie really thriving. She makes it into U of M, where she studies a Bachelor of Education. She graduates with a silver medal. She was an achiever. In 1929, she goes on this beautiful trip we've talked about, and then the crash happens. At this point in her life, it seems that she's at the top of the game, but spring 1930, she marries Raleigh Smith, and things start to turn. And I think the economic reality of being a female school teacher in Canada in the 1930s was that if you got a job, you hung on to it. Because anytime a teacher position came available, there were hundreds of applicants for these jobs on the prairies. And often pay was like, there's your room and board. Good luck getting any pay for your teaching position. This sort of, I want to call it almost subsistence teaching. You have to teach because you now have 2 little boys to take care of. Your husband does not have permanent work. This changed probably Marjorie's approach to even her work. It became very necessary. And then as we move into World War II, again, Marjorie's life is thrown into upheaval. Her husband joins a work camp in western part of Canada, building defense systems and wartime building projects. She's left being a single mother. So these moments of upheaval, wars, depression, immigration, built an incredibly strong character. And by all accounts, she was formidable. She was not a teacher that you wanted to mess with. But when she saw that students worked hard and really gave their effort, she was also heralded as the most supportive teacher you could ever have. She valued hard work.
If this question is too personal, I will absolutely edit it out. But it just struck me that you are a piano teacher.
Yes.
And you are, I don't know if I would use the word formidable, but you exude a presence and a self-confidence that is totally awesome. Has anyone in the family ever told you in what ways you are like her?
We come from a family of teachers. So Marjorie was a teacher, her daughter-in-law, my grandmother, teacher. So formidable, that one. My mother is a private music teacher, and I'm a private music teacher. I think if we look back at Marjorie's life, what were women's professional options in the early 1900s? Did she ever grow up thinking, oh, I want to teach? Or did this just seem like an accessible career option? I don't really know. But I think that you have to love the teaching process. For me, teaching is a lot of, no matter where they are, we're going to take them on a journey. We're going to help them along. And I would love to know, really, if I could have a conversation with Marjorie to ask her, how much do you love teaching? I don't know. But I think she loved quality. She loved hard work. Maybe that's transferred down.
That's fascinating. Both of my grandmothers were Saskatchewan teachers, one in the 1920s and one probably in the late 30s and 40s. And yeah, so I come from a long line, and I am an ESL teacher, not so.
Excellent. Yeah. I love how accessible, for better or for worse, the teaching career was for farm girls. You could be 16 or 17 and you desperately want off the farm. Through the whole certificate program, you could study on your own and you could change your life through education. Now it's a 4, 5, 6-year commitment to getting your ed degree. That's huge and that has value. But it gave farm girls a way to get off the farm if that's what they wanted.
Did she do her teacher training in Manitoba?
She did in multiple rounds, really culminating in her bachelor degree in 1925. Okay. But she started teaching at 16 with a 3rd class teaching certificate.
Yeah, I'm just curious if they called it normal school.
Yes, they did.
Yeah,
Bullet branded.
Both my grandmothers went to normal school. It sounds so funny to call it that, but if it's not a spoiler, tell us why the title is Yes, Miss Thompson.
I imagine Marjorie's first day teaching in a real classroom. She's young. Things are a little bit more crazy than she thought they were going to be because she's just a kid herself. And when she finally wins the respect of the kids and they get excited, the last line out of that chapter is, yes, Miss Thompson, when she tells them to do something. And it's, okay, they're listening to me now.
And that short sentence could be inflected various ways. Yes, Miss Thompson. It just sounds wonderful. I can't wait to read it. What are you working on now, Amy?
I am working on a novel set in the 1950s in Saskatchewan. I'm a Manitoba girl born and bred, but I spent 12 years in Ottawa. And then a couple years ago, we moved back to Saskatchewan, close to my husband's people for his job and his work. And 1950 Saskatchewan, rural community, I imagine a pianist, a music student from Toronto who makes a marriage choice that brings her to Saskatchewan. And she goes through culture shock, finding meaning and belonging in a very different community is the cusp of the story.
You haven't mentioned it yet, so maybe the answer is no. Is this based on any family history?
No.
So what's it like? Is there a difference when you're starting from something that's wholly imagined compared to a handed down family story?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I feel like you can let your imagination be a little bit more free. You can also put yourself a little bit more into it. Imagine, what would I think in this situation versus what would Marjorie or some other character think?
My mother, both parents came of age in the 50s in Saskatchewan. I think I saw on your bio that you have had other stuff published. What other kind of forms do you write in?
My first book was published by Signature Editions in Winnipeg, and it's called Micro Miracle. And that was my first long form. So this is my second book. Micro Miracle, it's the story of my daughter who was born 16 weeks premature. So she was a 24-weeker born in 2013, extremely premature, and it took quite a while before it was clear that she was going to live or not. And for that being a first pregnancy, a first birth, there was a lot to work through. So that was the memoir. But what brought me to writing before Micro Miracle was my music background. I write a lot of better practice papers for music teacher magazines specific to the industry. And then I have a collection of short stories, memoir focused pieces. I find a lot of my writing for fun, short form, usually brings the connections between being a mom, being a music teacher, being a prairie girl, and a rural kid, and fitting those pieces together. One essay I wrote was called Death in the Maiden. It was about, as my daughter was growing up, 4 or 5 years old, we were walking in the woods in Ottawa. We saw a dead fox. And I sheltered her from that so much because I didn't want her to see the dead fox. And comparing that to growing up on a hog farm in rural Manitoba, where death and animals is just part of life. And just reflecting on those differences in upbringing, things like that interest me.
Fascinating. I will hunt up the reference so people can look it up for themselves. What have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend, Amy?
Oh, so many things. This is a well-loved read. Sweet Francois by Irène Némirovsky, I think is how you would say her name.
Yes.
She, a Russian writer she was Jewish, spent much time in Paris, assumed falsely that World War II was going to pass in the same way that World War I did. And of course, for the Jewish community, it did not pass that way, and she was killed in Auschwitz. I think I've read everything she's written. My husband and I, we just recently came back from France 2 weeks ago, so I'm revisiting some of these places in Paris, etc., that's referred to. Another great one, I love this, is Dear Lupin. This is a collection of letters put together by Roger Mortimer and Charlie Mortimer, father-son, and they weren't intending it to be published. They were just writing really funny letters back and forth. The father was a sports writer, and Charlie was basically wayward. There's a lot of the father with good humor trying to get him off of drugs and trying to get him employed, but always with good humor. And I just think it's a charming book. And then this one I just picked up from the library this week, and I've been loving it. New biography on Agatha Christie. Yeah, by the wonderful Lucy Worsley, who's a BBC presenter. That's what's on my stack.
I'm sure there's probably at least one long chapter, if not several chapters, about her mysterious disappearance in days or 2 weeks or whatever it was. Yeah. No, that sounds great. You read very widely. That's wonderful. Maybe one last question about reading that ties back to your novel, Yes, Miss Thompson. Did you feel like, or do you feel now like you are writing within a tradition of Western Canadian fiction with protagonists like your great-grandmother?
I think you have to write what you know, right? And I think that I am so ingrained in the prairies, but with the added perspective of living in Eastern Canada for more than a decade, you notice your own peculiarities and proclivities when you've been away for a while and then when you come back. So probably the prairies are now entwined with me. This is it.
What a delightful conversation, Amy. I hope you'll come back. Thanks for being so generous with your time.
Thank you for having me, Sean. An awesome shirt, by the way. Let's just take a moment to dwell on the shirt.
Oh dear, I'm not sure. It's lovely. I love it, but it's pretty out there. My mom and my sister went to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and when Mom picked it off the rack, my sister said, "Mom, it's got people smoking pot on it," because she bought it at a cannabis shop. I don't know what my mother was doing in a cannabis shop, and I didn't ask. But
just best not to know. You might be tempted to write about it. Just draw a veil.
That's right. Thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you, Sean.
I just think that is such a gorgeous cover. And now that I know that her great-grandmother's in there, you can't see it, I think, on camera, but she's there. Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to reading this. Okay, I've had one of the best reading weeks of the year, I think, in terms of what I finished and what I've started and all that stuff. I managed to get that lengthy chat with the wonderful Scottish novelist Alan Radcliffe finished and posted this week about his absolutely incredible novel that came out last year, The Old Haunts. And so I hope that you'll check that out if you haven't already. This actually came out from Fairlight Books in 2023. I read it at the end of last year. The highest compliment I know how to pay this wonderful novel, as I said in the interview, is it was reminiscent of early Michael Cunningham. Just love these sentences and a very quiet, queer story. I just can't say enough about it. That is there for your viewing pleasure. I finished 3 books, and most of them I did start fairly recently. And then I have gotten a ways into 2, and I'm going to start 1. So that's what I'm going to tell you about from here on in. The first one I finished in time for my Patreon book club to discuss it was the Japanese novel The Thorn Puller by Hiromi Ito, translated from the Japanese by Jeffrey Engels. And we had our chat about this last Saturday. And the unfortunate thing was I left it too late with all the excitement going on with buying a house and blah, blah, blah. I didn't start it early enough so that I had to really rush to finish. And I think that part of the fact that I didn't absolutely love this novel had to do with that I read it in a compressed time frame, because no one should read a book in 3 days. It's sacrilegious, and I basically read most of it in about 3 days. I prefer 3 months, so that's when Anyway, I enjoyed it. It engaged me. It's not the best book I've ever read, and certainly not my favorite Japanese novel, but it is probably worth your time. There was mixed reactions to it amongst the book club members as well. I think it's following in the tradition of the I novel, which was Japanese autofiction that goes back to, I forget, the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's about her life, told in the first person, and she has woven in lots of stuff from literature. The fact that I'm not Japanese, this is not my original thought. Somebody in the book discussion last week said, because we're not immersed in Japanese culture, we're missing a lot of those literary and mythic references. She's not the most likable protagonist, and that didn't bother me. She is an oversharer, so some readers will appreciate that and others will be less comfortable with it in terms of bodily functions and so on. So a big part of the story is that her parents are living in Japan and Hiromi Ito is living in California. And her parents are elderly and they're needing increasing levels of support, not just from her, but from healthcare. Her mother becomes bedridden and so on. And so getting elderly people to the bathroom is there are pages and pages about that. And I think I did actually appreciate that. It's stark, it's not the most pleasant reading, but it's an important part of life that anybody who needs to go to the bathroom or is considering what it's going to be like when they're 90 and need to go to the bathroom and can't walk, all of that stuff is here. And I wouldn't say gory detail, but in quite a lot of detail. And similarly, aging bodies and so on. Hiromi Ito is a poet. She's a really famous writer in Japan. I had never heard of her until I heard of this book, but some of my Japanese students were quite familiar with her. And she's lived in California for, I think, decades. And she's got teenage kids or teenage and older kids in California and a husband. She calls him her husband. Apparently in real life they never did marry, but who's a lot older than her, and he's starting to need care, and their marriage is on the rocks. And so there's a lot of hectic family stuff amidst her friendships with other poets and so much. There's a lot going on here. I can't completely recommend it, so if you're the kind of reader that typically doesn't like what I love, this might be a book for you, and I wouldn't tell you not to read it. There's a lot about Japanese culture that I learned from this book that I never learned living in Japan, so it's rich with cultural stuff, and once you realize what the Thorn Puller is all about, and the spirituality of Japanese, which is, from the perspective of a Westerner, dare I put it this bluntly, really weird, just like they think our religious stuff is all really weird. All of that, there's a whole bunch about that as well, and a lot of feminist themes and so on. It's a mixed bag, and it's a wonderful bag, and you might want to try it, if I haven't turned you off of it. I also finished this Elizabeth Jane Howard novel, Odd Girl Out, buddied with Leah, and I've been so busy this week that Leah checked in on the last section, and I haven't had time to listen to her check-in, which is not like me, but this was published in 1972. Now, what's on the back here? What can I tell you about this? Okay, I can't tell you much. Another fascinating 5-star novel. Really, Elizabeth Jane Howard is one of the most important writers of the 20th century in any country, and I'm saying that defiantly because, God, the canon is weird, and what other people think are important writers, there's a lot of weirdness going on. In my universe, Elizabeth Jane Howard is where you should start with 20th century literature. She's just amazing. A dull married couple living outside London. They've been married about 10 years. They have a really good sex life, but otherwise they're really dull, and there's a lot more, and I don't mean graphic, but there's a lot more kind of graphic sexuality, sex scenes in this book compared to anything else I've read, and I've been reading Elizabeth Jane Howard chronologically. That was really fun and interesting and beautifully written. And the husband, Edmund, his stepmother's daughter comes to stay with them. I can't remember how many times Edmund's father's been married, but this marriage with this particular stepmother, Clara, only lasted 10 minutes. But for some reason, Edmund has always kept in touch with this really drama queen of a stepmother who lives now in France and is married to an Italian prince or something. And her troubled daughter, Arabella, comes to stay with them. Edmund doesn't know her very well. His wife has never met her. And she is one of the most fascinating characters in all of 20th century British literature. She is wounded, exuberantly sexual, completely honest, utterly naive about 50% of everything going on in the world, and completely and groundedly wise about the other 50% of things. So she comes out with these just pithy, wise statements about the philosophy of life in one moment, but she doesn't know how to make coffee. She's like that kind, and she's as sexy as all get out, and she's 15 or 20 years younger than this married couple. And the verb entangle, a web of love and desire entangles these three. So that's on the back, and I can't say any more without spoiling it. It was funny, tragic, and just beautiful, but madcap. It was a zany story, and I think I still need a few weeks to sit with it before I could say any more. I would say don't start your journey with Elizabeth Jane Howard with this novel, but you definitely want to read this if you're into her stuff. It was unforgettable. It was amazing, really, and confusing, and I loved it. The other one that I finished is for a pseudo-buddy read with my long-term friend of this channel and patron, Katie from Whitehorse. We're having our Zoom chat about it on Monday. So Katie, if you're watching, you don't want to listen to this, I don't think. You'd probably rather just talk to me without knowing any of what I'm going to say here, but that's up to you. It's Lucky Boy by Shanthi Sekaran, and it's going to be a strong contender for my top 5 or top 10 books that I read this year. I just loved it with all my heart. It's a novel that I think Doris of Aldi Books first put on my radar. If she didn't put it on my radar, it was her talking about it at length in about 2017 or 18, the year it came out. I've had it on my radar and not forgotten about it ever since. And I've now read it. I did it about 90% on audio because the audio book had 2 narrators, both of whom I loved. For the first time ever, I didn't know, I turned the video recorder off, the camera, or something happened, so I've lost the second half of my Friday read, so I'm going to have to redo all that and keep a very close watch on. I think probably I had my mouse pointer toggled over the stop button, and then I went to another screen and I tapped it by mistake, but I didn't notice, and so here it's a redo. Maybe I'll be more concise and articulate the second time around. Don't really want to have to do all that again, but here we go. Yeah, the audio narrators. It was at that point I went to look up the audio narrator's name, and I must have turned off the recorder. So I'm not going to do that again. The 2 main characters are both mothers. One is a young Mexican woman, the other is a little bit older Indo-European Californian woman. And so the 2 narrators, the narrator that did Soli's story is Roxana Ortega, and the one that did Kavia's story, the Indo-American in Berkeley, was Sonila Nankani, and they were both exquisite. So this is going on that very short list of books that I would say you must experience on audio, not just read it, although it's masterfully written. I just mean that the audiobook enhanced it for me. So I did much of this on the treadmill down in the basement. I am back on the treadmill fairly regularly. I have enough of a routine that I don't feel foolish in announcing that, so I've got to trim down a little bit before my husband, who I haven't seen for 3 years, meets me. Anyway, back to the book. I did go on quite a long time talking about the story, so let me try to say it again more briefly. It's about 2 mothers, and it is the story of adoption and immigration and all of those things, and a whole bunch of related issues set in about 2012. Soli is an undocumented immigrant to America, and her journey from her small town in Mexico, Oaxaca, if I'm pronouncing that state name, to getting to Berkeley, it was harrowing and fraught with violence and danger, but also a brief romance with a fellow Mexican immigrant, Checo, And then she arrives, and she lives with a cousin who's also undocumented in Berkeley, and gets a job as a nanny with one of those white liberal families that are so easy to caricature. And the characterization here goes deeper than character, but they reflexively agree with all of the liberal ideas, but they're so stupid. They're such stupid white people in so many important ways that they're laughable. And she starts working for them as a nanny, and then she discovers that she's pregnant. Plot ensues with that, and she gives birth to a boy, Ignacio, who she calls Nacho, and raises him. And this liberal white family that she's nannying for, they do accommodate her, and she brings her baby to work, and so on. And then things go awry, and I'm not going to do any spoilers here, but the other mother is one Indo-American woman, very professional chef, and her Silicon Valley employed husband, Rishi. So Rishi and Kavya. And Kavya wants to have a child, and the fertility treatments they have are expensive and harrowing, and I think that's all I'm going to say about that, other than that stuff happens. I'm not going to tell you anything about it, but there's enough information in the synopsis that it is safe for me to say that because Soli is detained by immigration when her boy Ignacio is about a year old, Ignacio gets put into the foster care system, and Kavya and Rishi become the foster parents, and then they look after him for the next year that the story takes us to. And as an adoptee, there was a lot of things in here, like it gave rise to a lot of questions that I would love to ask my mom. Was it difficult to bond with me as your adopted infant child? Now, Ignacio was fostered when he was over a year, so that's a different dynamic. But all of that is so beautifully expressed, and the social political stuff of 2012, immigration shit, Obama was quite shit about immigration. All of that is not in some kind of info-dumpy way, but that atmosphere is rendered so compellingly, and the characters are so rich and nuanced, and I just loved this book. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm looking forward to chatting with Katie about it, and stay tuned for some more stuff about this wonderful, important novel. What an incredible week of reading. Just incredible. And I have more to tell you. I'm not even close to being done, but those are the 3 books I finished. I have started 2 that I will tell you about. For the Irish Readathon, or for Irish Reading Month, since I'm not really officially taking part in the Readathon, but love to read Irish literature year-round. As a buddy read with Sonia of An Enthusiastic Reader, I'm now a few pages into The Pornographer by John McGahern. And I'm just loving this too. I'm about 25 pages in, and I can't wait to talk to Sonia about it. Our first check-in is next week sometime. The book opens with our narrator, who is a younger man. I don't know how young, maybe 30s, in Dublin. So he's picking his elderly uncle up at the train station to take him to visit our protagonist's aunt in hospital, and she is dying. Maybe she doesn't realize it yet, but everybody else realizes she's not long for this world. And so this uncle, he's a bit of a country bumpkin, a really compelling character. He takes him to see his sister in hospital. And this protagonist is a nephew of both of them. I don't know anything about his parents, who is a sibling with them. So I don't know that part of the story yet. But the old uncle, it was a difficult hospital bed meeting, and he weeps as soon as he steps out of the hospital. And that's a really moving scene. He's a mechanical genius, and I think he works in that trade connected to agriculture, or maybe just on his farm. That detail didn't stick, but what did stick was this marvelous scene. They've got several hours before the uncle has to get back on the train, and so he goes into a mechanic shop of some kind, because he said he can't deal with them by phone. It just doesn't work, and writing to them, and blah, blah, blah. I don't know when it's set. Oh, 1970s, okay. You know how little I care about when something's said, or how easily I forget that stuff. But in this mechanic shop, this uncle comes alive, and through his nephew's eyes, we just see that he would be awkward and mute and a loser in so many different situations, but once he's in his element, he just comes alive, and he has got a PhD worth of stuff in his brain. And can you think of a setting more uninteresting to me than being in a mechanical shop getting parts? But it's so masterfully done, and it's so revelatory about his character, and such a virtuosic scene early in the novel that I just loved it. He says goodbye to his uncle and he goes home and find out that he's the pornographer. He's down on his luck. Don't know much about him yet, but he goes back to his typewriter and continues to write this pornographic, smutty story. That's how he's making ends meet. Maybe that's his only job or one of his part-time jobs. I don't know the details, but there's a long answer from the smutty story, and it's quite literary. It didn't really do much for me, but didn't have the right kind of people in the story to float my boat, so to speak, but that's where I'm at. The writing is so incredible, and I am not at all surprised because I read McGahern's memoir, All Will Be Well, a couple of years ago and absolutely loved it. So this is starting out great. You know what? I should get a different bookmark. I have one that I ordered off Etsy. It's a picture of Jesus. I'll put the GIF up where Jesus is peeking around the corner and saying, is that smut or is that porn? I need to put that one in this book. That would be a perfect pairing bookmark. Maybe somebody needs to make a bookmark pairing tag or challenge or something. Anyway, Sean, you're getting lightheaded. Let's wrap up, shall we? That's starting out fabulously. This is a book that has been floating around in the ether. The reason that I'm doing it now on audio is because it dawned on me, now that I'm finished doing Lucky Boy on audio, and now that I'm going back to the gym, I need an audiobook to get me to go down there, because otherwise, if I can't be listening to an audiobook or a bookish podcast or even a news podcast when I'm on the treadmill, I'll never go. I selected this book fairly willy-nilly. It is called Hangman by Naya Binyam, and she is a bit reticent, or she doesn't make a big production out of where her people come from, so I had to really dig to find out that her father was Ethiopian, persecuted in Ethiopia, came to the East Coast, I believe Boston, either a refugee or an immigrant, and has been persecuted there for being black. And I don't know anything about her mother, but she grew up in Boston, now lives somewhere in California, LA, the last I heard. But I had to really dig to get what the connection is. This novel, which I'm going to read you the opening page in a bit, just because it's so hypnotic and it's so fabulously strange in a way that wouldn't work for everybody, and I don't know how to talk about it, so I'm just going to read from it. But it's about a man who finds himself back in his home country in Africa. We'll just listen to this. This is how it begins. In the morning, I received a phone call and was told to board a flight. The arrangements had been made on my behalf. I packed no clothes because my clothes had been packed for me. A car arrived to pick me up. The radio announced traffic due to an accident involving a taxicab driver, a police officer, and a woman whose occupation the dispatcher did not specify. But there was no traffic. My ticket was in the breast pocket of my jacket, which was handed to me as I exited the passenger door. Waiting in line, I felt I had no body, but by the time I reached security, I was hungry. Inside my carry-on, I found 2 apples and a croissant, which tasted like nothing. The security agent asked me for my name. I gave him my driver's license, walked through the metal detector, and then my body went away. Before takeoff, a flight attendant announced our destination. Everyone cheered. The passenger to my right asked if I was happy to be going home. He didn't speak our destination's national language, which had become the language of the plane. I told him that I was neither happy nor unhappy. He said he understood where I was coming from, because his work had introduced him to people like me. He said that people like me had changed his life. It was true that they needed money, but the fact that he gave it to them had nothing to do with what they meant to him. His real life, outside of our destination, was complicated by ambivalence. Since childhood, his basic needs had been met as if by an invisible force. At first, he believed his mother and father were providing for him, but when they died, he was surprised to feel he had suffered no loss. Care, he realized, didn't originate within his parents, whose protection remained palpable in almost everyone he encountered. Waitstaff, his internist, even the Prime Minister. It had merely taken up residence in their bodies, which he didn't need to visit, because the cemetery had nothing to do with the rest of his life. And that's how it starts out, and it continues in that wacky, entrancing way. And everybody he meets, and he seems confused whether he knows them or not, and they tell him their meandering, fascinating stories, and he gets to this country that he's from, that he doesn't know who sent him there or why he's there, or he doesn't seem to have any agency. And there's so much about bodies and the absence of bodies, and it's just absolutely to repeat myself, entrancing. Has anybody read this? It's not a book that would appeal to everyone, and it's only a bare start on it, but I am completely engaged. So those two are in progress. I'm going to be starting one on the weekend because I'll be finished the book I'm currently reading to my mum by then. And so I've chosen one that, when I read the opening on the recent book haul, I laughed so hard that I wanted to just keep reading. And Mum particularly likes the ones that have some humor, and this one definitely does. The book is called A Wreath for the Enemy by Pamela Frankau, and it was published in 1954 originally. I'll put a link to that book haul, and in fact, I now know how to put a link that takes you right to that particular point in the video where I read the first page in a bit, because it is really hilarious. I won this Virago edition of it, along with one other Virago, in a giveaway that the fabulous Nora from Dublin and originator of Spinster September, she did a giveaway last September, and I won this and another one, and that's why I have it, and I'm going to start reading it to Mum, and I can't wait. All right, that is my Friday Reads. Thank you so much for watching.